Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
I'm Jill, the host of The Nourished Child. Let me ask you something. Do you wonder if your child is getting all the nutrition they need? Or do you feel unsure about what's going on with your child and their eating? Feeding kids is hard. I've raised 4 of my own children, and as a pediatric dietitian who works with kids and families, I know the job of nourishing and nurturing our children is a big one, full of emotional swings, frustrations, and worries. That's why I created thenourishedchild.com, the ultimate parent resource for children's nutrition and feeding. There, you will find free articles, e-guides, and programs to help you better understand your child, food, your own feeding, and their eating. Check out The Nourished Child today. Head to thenourishedchild.com. And now for the show. Hey friends, why do some kids always seem interested in eating, while others could care less? Why are some kids more fussy about foods and others have very little discretion? There are a lot of factors that may play into how your child reacts to and approaches food. One reason may be genetics. It turns out that children, and I suspect all of us, have a genetic predisposition to be attracted to food, disinterested in food, or sensitive to our sense of fullness. Welcome back, friends, to the Nourished Child Podcast. I'm Jill Castle, your host. I'm a pediatric dietitian and mom to 4 adultish children. My experience includes running a private practice dedicated to children and their families, hosting the Nourished Child website, which is a nutrition resource for parents of all ages, yes, including teens, and as an author. My 6th book, Kids Thrive at Every Size, will be on sale on August 13th, 2024. Soon you'll be able to head over to thenourishedchild.com, where I'll have a place where you can pre-order a copy of the book. This is episode number 205, and today I'm talking about your child's approach to food and what it may mean for their eating behaviors. I'm actually revisiting an interview I had with Alison Miller, a researcher at the University of Michigan who studies appetite traits in children. Before we start, though, I wanted to set the stage for our conversation. First, I want to talk with you about the Gemini Twin Birth Study. This was conducted by Jane Wardle and her team. They looked at appetite traits in 2,400 twins born in England and Wales in 2007. Their parents were asked to describe their baby's eating behavior during the first 3 months of life while they were exclusively milk-fed. Parents completed 4 subscales of eating: enjoyment of food, food responsiveness, slowness in eating, and satiety responsiveness. The researchers completed some complicated genetic model fitting also to observe whether the type of eating response had an actual genetic basis. And here's what they found. The likelihood to inherit a genetic trait for slowness in eating and satiety responsiveness was high. And the likelihood to inherit a genetic trait for food responsiveness and enjoyment of food was moderate. So what do these terms even mean? So let's walk through these because I talk about these terms with my clients quite a bit, especially when parents don't understand necessarily why their child is behaving a certain way. And while this can be environmental, it can be child specific, in this episode, I want to explore the genetic predisposition for these responsiveness or approaches to food. So this first term, food responsiveness, it basically measures a child's tendency to want to eat when they are prompted by foods that they consider palatable, like sweets or treats. So an example of this would be, even if my child is full, she finds room for her favorite foods. Enjoyment of food is another measurement that they looked at, a genetic trait that they looked at, and enjoyment of food captures the reward a child experiences when they are eating. So, for example, I have a child who very much enjoys eating, and I can tell you when we started solids, and this was back in the day when we started solids at 4 months, we don't do that anymore. We start at 6 months now. But back in the day when we started solids with her, I could not get over the fact that every time I put a spoonful of food in her mouth, she would moan. She would, as she was chewing. And I knew that this child enjoyed eating. So these are some traits that you might be seeing in your children. So again, food responsiveness, a child's tendency to want to eat when prompted by palatable foods, and enjoyment of food captures that reward that a child experiences while eating. Now, both of these, food responsiveness and enjoyment of food, when children have higher scores for these two approaches, it indicates that they have a more avid appetite. So think about that. Being more enticed and responsive and sensitized to food and really enjoying the process of eating and enjoying the taste and experience of food may indicate that a child has a more avid appetite. Now, another approach that they measured is called satiety responsiveness. And this really just measures a child's fullness threshold. An example would be, my child gets full before his or her meal is finished. And the other approach factor that goes with satiety responsiveness is called slowness in eating. Slowness in eating captures the pace at which a child finishes a meal. So, for example, a child who is slower in their eating pace, a parent might say, my child takes more than 30 minutes to finish a meal. So, when children score higher on satiety responsiveness and slowness in eating, it indicates that they may have better control of their appetite. So the researchers also did a second study. Jane Wardle and her team did a review paper, or actually really it was her team that wrote a review paper about the work that she did in her lifetime. And they also looked at two other measurements that predicted the tendency to either undereat or overeat in response to emotions. So emotional overeating is when a child eats more because they're anxious or they're worried or they're sad or they're lonely. And this is thought to predispose them to gaining excess body fat. Emotional undereating is when a child eats less because they're feeling strong emotions like sadness or anxiety. They eat less when they're upset. And this is thought to protect against body fat gain. And then last, food fussiness, our classic picky eating, right? Food fussiness is a term that they use as they looked at all these different styles of eating, if you will. And it assesses the tendency for a child to be highly selective about what they will agree to eat and captures both refusal to try new foods as well as pickiness about the textures and tastes of familiar foods. So food fussiness, they conclude, may offer some protection against excess body fat gain. Makes sense, right? We all live in an obesogenic environment, but not everyone is overweight. Even within the same family, there can be striking differences between the size of siblings living in the same household. We see this as parents. There can be substantial variation in a child's vulnerability and sensitivity to their food environment. And this has a genetic basis. Remember, we can never change the genes, but we can have influence over the environment. So in summary, your child's appetite traits or their approach to food may actually give you clues as to whether they have a tendency or a higher risk for overeating, undereating, or eating just the right amount. And with that, here is Dr. Alison Miller and our amazing conversation, one of my all-time favorite conversations. So I hope you enjoy, and I'll be back at the end to conclude this. Hi, Alison. Welcome to the Nourished Child podcast. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the work around self-regulation in children, because it is a really fascinating area, I think.
I do too. So I'm a developmental psychologist. My PhD is really focused on early childhood development, infancy, and parenting, and kind of the interplay between parents and infants and social emotional development. I've now been in the School of Public Health here at the University of Michigan for about 16 years, and I study lots of different things around child and family health, including self-regulation as it relates to kind of child and family health behaviors.
Mm-hmm. And that is, when you think about self-regulation, most of the listeners of this podcast are parents, some professionals, pediatricians, other pediatric dietitians. When you think of self-regulation, what does that mean to you?
Absolutely. It's really kind of a core developmental concept. And I think about self-regulation as our ability to control emotions, behaviors, and thoughts, usually in service of a goal.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're thinking about young children, it's really a developmental process. And I can kind of share more about that process.
Yeah, I would love to hear that, because I imagine with a lot of things that are developmentally based, they start in infancy and sort of like roll throughout childhood until adulthood. Is that the same with self-regulation? Does it change over time or?
Absolutely. So really self-regulation during infancy is what we actually call co-regulation with a caregiver. So if people have heard of these kind of serve and return interactions between infant and caregiver, what we mean by that is sort of the infant will make an interactional move, sort of gesture or coo to the caregiver, and then the caregiver can respond to that. Mm-hmm. So over time, the infant, like if they're upset, they can reach out to the caregiver and the caregiver can respond to help calm the upset. And that's an example of an interaction that helps shape self-regulation, really in this process of co-regulation between infant and caregiver.
Okay. I imagine with appetite cues and feeding, since that is such a big part of infancy, that's happening for that as well.
Absolutely. So in that feeding context, the infant is giving cues, the caregiver is responding to cues. One thing to note, actually, with regard to that is that infants vary, and I talk about this all the time, infants and children and later adults vary in their clarity of cues, their emerging self-regulation as a result of lots of different factors, including temperament. So the idea of how a child is sort of physiologically wired really plays into this idea of self-regulation, certainly in those early years.
Yeah, I spoke with Mary Sheedy Kersinka, who was the author of Raising Your Spirited Child.
Yes.
I don't know, but she is like a guru on temperament and how it is really hardwired. But there are other factors too, right? I'm thinking just environmental factors.
100%.
What are some of those? Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of my work, actually, I'm focused on these sort of early child factors. But one thing that's so critical to keep in mind is our environment and how that shapes everything, including our self-regulation. And so what really unfolds over the child's early life is that interplay between temperament, parenting, the other kind of social environments that children interact in. So, for example, preschool is a context where we see a lot of research on eating behavior and sort of how peers can shape a child's eating behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Some of our research has looked at really kind of stress and the stress of the home environment and the context in which a family is living. So things like food insecurity, poverty, general other stressors in the family's life can certainly impact the feeding context parent stress, and also child self-regulation and eating behavior. So it's complicated.
It is. It is. And so can you give us an idea of what it might look like if a child is not good at self-regulation?
With regard to eating behavior, the types of things that researchers have studied and, parents bring in concerns around are things like out of control eating, overeating. My child is constantly eating, constantly asking for food. These are kind of both questionnaire items that we ask parents as researchers, but also real concerns of parents sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what dysregulated or poorly regulated eating can look like.
So right now in this book I'm writing a chapter on eating, and some of the things that I've sort of discovered, and I would love your perspective on this, is that there's a genetic component to appetite traits. So one of the things is food responsiveness versus satiety responsiveness. Can you explain those two things and how they might show up? I think you sort of alluded to that in some of those comments earlier, but how those two things differ and how they might show up.
Absolutely. So food responsiveness is the idea that we are responding sort of to cues in our external environment that come to us around food. These happen all the time to all of us and even to little kids, even in sort of media contexts. I'm sure you've thought a lot about that as well. So we're all influenced by these sort of external cues to food. One of the things that's interesting is that, like with temperament, we vary in our what we call appetitive traits, and food responsiveness is one of those. So research has really shown that people have different individual differences in terms of how responsive they are to these external cues. Another thing to note about food responsiveness is that the situation can sometimes also cause differences in food responsiveness. So, for example, if we're tired, if we're thinking about lots of different things and we can't focus on our hunger needs, for example, or if we're really hungry, those can all sort of shift our food responsiveness, those external cues.
So what I hear you saying is that food responsiveness is sort of, it's like when a parent will say, my child's really triggered by food, triggered by candy, can't be at a party without diving in and is out of control with their eating. Is that an example of being food responsive?
That's a great example of being food responsive. Yes.
Okay.
And one that parents face all the time in environments that are not always under their control, which is what makes it really challenging.
Yes. But what would you say to a parent whose child has inherited this appetite trait?
Well, I do think the concept of temperament is helpful here. If you think about it, anyone who's interacted with lots of children, had more than one child, can kind of resonate to that idea that temperament really varies between kids, and so can appetite and these appetitive traits, food responsiveness, satiety responsiveness, enjoyment of food, reward sensitivity. So all of these kind of food-related appetitive traits can vary. And so I sometimes say, just like you wouldn't, you keep an extra eye on your impulsive, active child who might run out in the road in terms of their temperament, you may need to sort of monitor the food environment somewhat more tailored to your child's appetitive traits. And so I think that's one way to kind of conceptualize that for parents in a way that I think could be helpful, to think about how your children respond differently to like the same food stimulus.
To me, it was super fascinating having, worked with families for so many years and hearing this real concern from parents and understanding that there is like sort of an inherent basis to that. It's not a failure on parenting. It's not it's just sort of a part of who their child is. And what is interesting to me, and I'd love your perspective on this, is that there's a lot of talk, where is the line between setting that child, that food responsive child, up for success and that fine line with restrictive feeding, which we know food restriction or restrictive feeding practices can drive sort of that over focus on food. And so those two things together, it starts to get to be like this blurry line, like what's good for the child and what is going to be sort of crossing the line and turn out to be not so good for the child. Well, I'm interested in your perspective.
It's a hard line. Rather, as you said, it's a fuzzy line. So yeah, that's a real tension. And so I think many of us are sort of hypersensitized to not restrict in that way that you described in terms of not putting too much focus on restriction. However, I'd also say we live in such a, what we call obesogenic or obesity promoting food environment that it's hard not to have some control, restriction, moderation operating. And so I think that one thing that can be helpful to think about is the food environment, especially for a younger child. It's easier to control what you bring in the home and not being restrictive, explicitly around certain particular foods that can be never consumed. That's not very healthy. But the idea of managing a food environment and providing nutritious and also filling choices when possible so that the child's not actually hungry. Because we also know that there's genetic and other variation in hunger, and it's kind of difficult to tell.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's how I sort of think about it too. It's especially for little ones, out of sight, out of mind. If it's not there, it's not something that you have to navigate and negotiate every day, especially for a child who's food responsive or even, like you said, impulsive. Their executive functioning might tend towards more impulsivity. I just think that abundant availability is very difficult for these children.
Yes. I think it relates to self-regulation and executive function, as you mentioned, because we all live in this environment of food abundance, many of us. And so often also the abundant foods are not the most nutritious ones. Those foods take some more work to acquire. And so especially kids who are food responsive or reward sensitive, they might have to activate their self-regulation or executive function skills to a greater degree to actually resist those foods. And so I think that that's important for parents also to keep in mind. It might be harder for some kids to resist those foods, and it might take more work for kids to resist those foods, for example.
Yeah, that's really good. Can you explain reward sensitive? I'm not sure the listeners will know what that means.
Sure. Or reward responsive is another way to think about it. It's that idea that, again, sort of biologically, certain people are more, get more bang for the buck from certain foods than others. There's a really interesting literature on sort of food addiction and properties, particularly of ultra-processed foods, that we're all reward responsive to as a species. But there's also this sort of natural variation in how much food is rewarding to us, sort of neurologically and through other biological means.
And then satiety responsiveness.
Oh, yes. Satiety responsiveness is that idea that sort of you know when you're full and you reach that point, and bringing it back to the feeding context, you're sending out cues that maybe hopefully are clear to your caregiver that you are full. And so the caregiver can read those cues, again, talking about that infancy period, and stop feeding when the satiety cues are given from the infant. Those of us who spent a lot of time looking at infant behavior know that it's not always very clear. And so infants do a lot of behaviors, and we sometimes don't know why they're doing different behaviors. And so I think that's a challenge for a lot of caregivers. Like, is my infant hungry? Should I be feeding my infant more? You don't want to not feed an infant, but at the same time, we also know that infants can be overfed as well. So it's kind of a little bit of a balancing act there too, in terms of getting to know your infant's signals.
Yeah.
Some infants are clearer than others.
Sure.
It's individual variability.
Yeah, sure. And what about children maybe on the smaller bodied side who might have satiety responsiveness who might have those signals firing. I feel like I had a child like that I raised who, boom, done. Like it didn't, when he was done, he was done. And it could be the whole plate of food was eaten sometimes, and sometimes just it was picked at. And, I know parents out there who might have a child who looks like perhaps a quote unquote picky eater because they just graze and they hardly eat anything. I'm wondering if a child like that might be an example of a child who might have more satiety responsive traits.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that child might reach satiation, so be full with less food than another child because they're more aware of their feelings of fullness.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for a parent who's sort of worried my child's a picky eater, that might create kind of a feeding dynamic where the parent's trying to feed more, even if the child is full and aware that they're full. And again, thinking about what that child's state is. Maybe that child's stressed. Maybe that child's sleepy.
Mm-hmm.
There could be other things going on, but that child could also be an example of satiety responsiveness.
Right. You've mentioned stress a couple of times, and I think you've done some research on stress. Can you tell us a little bit about how does stress play out in a child's ability to self-regulate? Like, how do those interact?
Yeah, great question. So in the eating domain, one thing that we know about stress is that when we are biologically stressed, our physiology or our stress biology, our biological responses to stress are actually soothed by certain foods. So foods that are high in sugar, fat, and salt are actually biologically soothing to us. So if you think about that sort of cycle, if we feel stressed and then we eat those kinds of foods and those make us feel calmed and better, we can see kind of how that cycle could perpetuate.
Mm-hmm.
And then we bring self-regulation into the mix. And really, self-regulation is sort of functioning to calm the system down in the case of emotional self-regulation, focus attention in the case of sort of cognitive self-regulation skills, help us inhibit behavior, maybe if we're feeling impulsive behavior to reach out and grab something that we'd like to eat. So self-regulation can kind of pull that back in.
Mm-hmm.
We know that when we're stressed, our self-regulation in general is often decreases.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're very intimately related, and increased stress over time. So kids who are, for example, growing up in really chronically stressed households are more challenged to develop sometimes effective self-regulation because their environments are not as predictable. And that idea of really predictable, consistent responses are important for early development of self-regulation skills.
Okay. So when you're talking about stress, that could be things like poverty. It can be food insecurity, as you mentioned before. But could it also be things like, getting bullied at school? Could it be difficult peer interactions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it can be stress, sort of chronic stress, family level, or sort of social context type stress, like food insecurity, housing insecurity, that a child might not really be as aware of as a parent. The child could also pick up on the parent's stress. And we know from some research that parent stress certainly can transmit to the child biologically and through behaviors. And then that child can also experience sort of stress in the moment. And so some of our research we've looked at, done some stress research where we elicit a moderate stress for children, and we look at sort of how much they're eating and what they're eating afterwards. And we've found some evidence to indicate that when children are more stressed in our protocols, so it's not real life stress, but it's like a mild lab-based stress, they will sort of eat more, even if they've already eaten, a full lunch, for example. We present them with some tempting foods and watch what happens.
Yeah.
So it's mimicking a little bit what could happen in real life there.
And that must be emotional eating, or is that what that category is?
Exactly.
Okay.
Sort of emotional overeating, it often in response to stress. That's the stress and eating link can be a little tricky because Some people emotionally overeat in response to stress. Some people don't feel like eating when they're stressed.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's important to think about the timing. So I think that back to parenting, thinking about, my child's not eating a lot right now. Maybe they had a stressful day at school and they don't feel like eating. Or my child had a stressful day at school. Now they're eating a ton because it's been a few hours since their stress has passed and now they're ravenous.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely a complicated set of linkages that operates through biology and behavior and prior experience.
It's fascinating because I think that, 10 years ago, you might have as a researcher, but like as a parent, I was not thinking about emotional eating and stress.
Mm-hmm.
I knew about self-regulation in infancy, but I wasn't really titrating it to the older years and playing it out in development.
Mm.
And so it's just really fascinating that a lot of what we kind of know happens in adults is now being seen in children.
Absolutely. Well, and as someone who studies a lot around early life stress in children, we, like you said, those of us who've been studying it or have been aware, but it is becoming much more, I think, commonly known by the general public and parents that even if children who are very young, so under age 3 or under age 1, experience severe stresses and adversities early in life, they may not even cognitively remember it, but their body and their physiology do remember it. And so that can come out in different ways, including eating behavior over time.
Wow.
I do want to couple that with saying if a child has experienced early life stress, there's many chances to repair and recover from that. So I always like to discuss the importance of early life stress and experiences, but then it's not a permanent state.
Yeah. The brain is very plastic at that stage, right? And that's a good thing as well.
Yes. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned developmental stages and self-regulation. Can you kind of take us through, I guess, what happens as children age and in terms of self-regulation?
Absolutely. So in that infancy period, it's really all about that caregiver infant interaction. The caregiver is really supporting this co-regulation. What really happens during those toddler and preschool years, we see a lot of examples of sort of struggles to overcome big emotions and big feelings and lots of impulsivity. That's kind of natural state of a toddler age child. So like 1 to 3 year old, right?
Big emotions.
That's what they're doing. That's what they're all about. And so by the time that kids hit preschool, like 3 to 5 year olds, most kids, at least in this country, are attending preschools with a group of other kids and a teacher. And so they're sort of learning to kind of function as a group member and have to pull together some level of self-regulation to control those, again, big feelings that can arise in group sharing, take your turn, wait your turn kind of situations.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are really developing across early childhood. When we talk about executive function, which is sort of a cognitive element of self-regulation, we're talking about most commonly things like working memory, cognitive flexibility, or this idea that you can shift between different kind of modes of thinking or different choices.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also talk about behavioral inhibition, which is really impulse control.
Yeah.
And so a number of those skills kind of develop more over those school age years. They're developing in early childhood, but if we think about those skills in school age kids, so like 6 to 10 year olds, they're really important for sort of schooling and academic achievement and problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say those skills are sort of on display in that time period. There's lots of early childhood precursors to those. But what we also know is that these continue to develop even into our late 20s, many of these executive function skills. So you hear a lot about sort of the adolescent period, it's disrupted by puberty and focus on social peer interaction and all this internal and external influences. But thinking about their executive function skills, they're really still actively developing that whole adolescent to really emerging adulthood period, because their prefrontal cortex is not yet fully developed until about that time.
Yeah.
So,
and executive functioning, just for parents out there who might be listening, it's really sort of making decisions about the behaviors that you're going to participate in or react to. I mean, I know it incorporates, context of what you remember, what you've learned, and incorporating that in your decisions.
Right. It's those sort of cognitive skills that underlie a lot of our decision making. And when we think about kids getting into sort of broader contexts and making bigger, more impactful decisions, like what teens are doing, that's when executive function skills also become really important around kind of risk-taking behaviors, impulsive actions, and then thinking actually back to reward sensitivity, things like substance use. There's of course an interplay there with executive function skills and decision making, and being able to kind of think ahead about what those implications of your current immediate impulses or decisions are. Another important piece of executive function as we get older.
Yeah. Forecasting.
Yes.
What will happen.
Yeah. Future orientation.
Yeah. Parenting teenagers is not for the weak or the thin-skinned. When we think about self-regulation of eating, you hinted towards a couple of challenges that make it harder for children to self-regulate. The food environment, for one, stress for another. Are there other challenges that come to mind for you?
When I think about talking with parents, I think there are those sort of individual child challenges, like appetitive drive, as we were talking about earlier. So how that varies across kids, and especially, again, being a parent of more than one child myself, one kid can act one way and you think you've got it under control, and then another kid can sort of surprise you and act a different way. And so it throws some of our parenting confidence into doubt.
Yes.
And so I do always like to say, there are these child factors that can sort of just present different challenges. I guess one thing that is hard, but I think important in parenting in terms of self-regulation, is just trying to provide those structured and expectable, predictable environments as much as we can. I think we think about it a little bit more even with very young children, because we have nap time and meal times, can sometimes be more planful, or at least more frequent. But I think it's an important concept to keep in mind as children get older. And I think we all benefit from structure and routine. Yeah. So it helps support our own self-regulation, I would say also as parents or as adults who are trying to model self-regulation in a variety of domains for our kids. So I'm not sure if that's as much challenges or maybe sort of strategies to combat some of these challenges that come up.
Yeah, I mean, I am a structure girl. I can shout that from the rooftop left and right. I think it's so important, obviously, for self-regulation. But I think I was just talking to somebody earlier today about just even appetite. Sort of, if you can sort of get meal times and snack times on a rhythm, they can really line up with appetite and digestion. So the physical and that rhythmic, and that helps a child be able to say, oh, I'm hungry. I feel it. Oh, great. Here comes a meal,
Yeah.
When we talk about children and health behaviors, not just eating, but other behaviors, exercise, engagement with social media and screens, sleep. How can parents help their kids become more self-regulated? And I think you actually have a beautiful article on that. Behavior change techniques to enhance self-regulation in a health promotion context.
Wordy title.
Yeah. So how can parents help their kids become more self-regulated? We talked a little bit about structure with eating, but when we're looking at some of those other overall components to a child's health, what are some of your top tips for that? Or what have you found in your research?
Yeah, well, I think that You mentioned a lot of different health behaviors, all of which I've researched a little bit. And sleep is really something that is foundational. I just call it a foundational developmental context for child development, really. And that's another place where I think routines can be just made a little more explicit. Bedtime in particular. There's a recent article that just came out that looked at bedtime in relation to, it was a sleep intervention. And basically what they found is that if you move up bedtime a bit earlier, that's where sort of the action is in terms of promoting more sleep. And what you just noted about, I would call it like circadian rhythms, or that sort of idea of everything is expected and regular in terms of timing. That's really important for both sleep and eating behavior. So in terms of those broad tips or recommendations, I often talk about family routines, and those can be around mealtime, bedtime. Those are kind of the big ones, certainly. Another important piece, I think, that we talked about in that article is parent modeling of not only sort of, and perhaps not perfect, health behavior, but kind of talking about choices around health behavior and the value that we might place on sleep. And, oh my goodness, I feel so much better when I've slept well. Sort of pointing out these moments of noticing how I do better when I get good sleep, for example. So making those processes or observations or behaviors really obvious to the kids and pointing it out, both in the kids and in the parents, and maybe not choosing a moment when a child is having a hunger tantrum to do it, but then maybe later reflecting and saying, gosh, you know what? I think you were really crabby because you were kind of hungry. And then did you notice when you were not hungry, you felt better and that problem's easier to solve? And so as a parent, kind of helping your child make connections between those, like, I call them like biobehavioral states of hunger, sleepiness, emotional distress. And when you do something about that to address those states, you can kind of then open up and do more things.
Yeah.
So I think that is an important piece of parenting, and hard, of course.
Yeah. I mean, we're on our toes all the time as parents, right? It's like there's no downtime. There's always a teachable moment or an observation or a connection or
absolutely
a chore to do.
And I'll say too, just on that note, because of that, because I study parenting, there's so much, especially in the eating and feeding domain, there's so much parent blaming that happens.
Yeah.
And I really like to try to emphasize there are always more chances that you get to bring these messages home and to structure the environment and to try again, like therapy. You have many opportunities to kind of work on these considerations. And so just trying to kind of point out the positive moments of connection, I think, are really important.
Yeah. And I think that is I thank you for saying that, because I do think that it's a long childhood. You have these kids 18 years, 365 days a year times 18. I mean, there's just a lot of opportunity to just keep honing the utensil, right? Just keep sharpening your skills and learning more. My drive has always been to just sort of bring more understanding to nutrition for kids and feeding for kids, and just this whole, understanding of every child's different, even with their eating habit, their eating style, their appetite, their ability to self-regulate. And all of that ties together and produces, the child that you're looking at the dinner table and what they're doing, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. That whole child perspective, right? Because children are not just their appetite or their sleep behavior or their physical activity behavior or their emotional
size
and
or their size or their temperament, or there's so many facets to a child that feed into, again, what you're getting up out of bed and sitting at the breakfast table with, and I mean all of these things, and they can change every day, right? So If parents or professionals who are listening would like to learn more about cultivating self-regulation in children, do you have your favorite resources that you'd like to share aside from your own research?
One site I go to a lot, and I do this when I teach in the School of Public Health. I teach masters in public health students who are not necessarily going to go out and work directly with children and families, but I talk a lot about how can we infuse this understanding of child development and kind of family needs into whatever context you're going into. So you could be a nutritionist, you could be a public health department lead, that kind of thing. And so one of the resources I like to bring up is that Center for the Developing Child. They're based out of Harvard, and they have a lot of good resources on sort of development of self-regulation, the importance of early self-regulation, parent-child relationships, parents' own self-regulation and early experiences. So that's one. And they have a lot of good little short videos and little explanatory pieces around child development that also kind of contextualize it to say, a lot of children are growing up in, tough circumstances, and here's what we know. So that's one. And then I guess I would also say there are a lot of resources at, for example, like the Annie E. Casey Foundation, again, to kind of get that broader picture of what children are kind of going through. And that's beyond eating behavior, but touching on considerations of children, mental health of children, what families are facing, the stresses families are facing, and that kind of thing. So if people are like on the lookout for a report about what we know about this group of kids, that's a good resource that I tend to go to.
Thank you for that. I think that, and you probably feel this too, that parents are just so, overwhelmed with health information at this juncture and how to raise a healthy kid and so much guilt and that you mentioned before. And so I think what's coming out now is just that there's just so much more to know. It's not just eat right, move more. There's just so much more. And I personally hope that listeners find that freeing and positive and exciting, because you don't have to just focus on what your child's eating and whether they're getting out the front door and staying outside for an hour. There's so many other nurturing good things that you can learn about your child and help and focus on. And so this whole concept of self-regulation and eating and all the things to help children become self-regulated with their eating and with all the other health behaviors that are important is, I really appreciate having you come on and talk about that, because I think it just opens another window for parents to be able to view their child and see what's going on with them. So if listeners would like to get in touch with you, Alison, how could they do that?
They can send me an email.
Okay.
And I could say my email address.
I can put it in our show notes. I have it for you.
A website.
Yeah.
One thing I think, as you were just finishing up talking, I was thinking about, I don't know if I explicitly said that importance of relational health kind of between parent and child. That's something that, again, you have many opportunities to build relational health across the course of your life with your child. And that can happen in small moments that are just repeated. And so much of what we know about self-regulation is that it develops in this relationship context. We think about it a lot in infancy, but somewhat less as kind of kids get older. And I think it's important to kind of remember that relational health is an important concept kind of throughout development.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for adding that, because if that relationship isn't in a good place, then everything else becomes harder, right?
Right. It's just such a good resource, and it's really helps. Its function is to repair, when things are kind of falling apart, and also serve as that secure base for children to go out and explore and do new things. And then they can kind of come back and check back in. So that's really foundational, really, for most things child development related.
Yeah. Well, I'm obsessed with child development. I just will tell you that. That's why I co-authored Fearless Feeding. We have like a whole section on child development. I just love how it informs why children do the things that they do.
Yeah.
It just gives such a window into what their motivations are. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much. Really lovely to talk with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Every time I speak with my clients about food approach, they are often quite able to pinpoint their own child's tendencies around food. Things like, my kid gets so excited about food, or my kid is talking about food all the time. They're so preoccupied with what will be served at the party or on the holiday. Or my kid could care less about food. They just seem to eat air and barely get by. I myself recognize the tendencies in my own 4 kids. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's more to this story. What is available to children at a given point in time matters quite a bit, but so do your parenting interactions, your child's executive functioning skills, their developmental stage. Eating is complex. It is not straightforward. The reason I wanted to share this information is because this really just kind of gets to the tip of the iceberg. In the book, Kids Thrive at Every Size, I devote a whole chapter to eating and I review the research. I dive into not only appetite traits, but biological reasons for eating, emotional reasons for eating, your child's temperament. So there's a lot of things that go into this. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. But for me, my hope is that for you, you continue to build your knowledge and understanding of your unique child so that you can better support them. So until next time, make sure you give that amazing child in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.